Well, I want to start by sharing a story with you today. There was a fellow by the name of Bill Irwin who hiked the Appalachian Trail. You've heard of the Appalachian Trail, I'm sure, right? Long trail, thousands of miles long. And this one fellow, he hiked the Appalachian Trail despite the fact that he was blind. There's an article in 1992. Irwin stumbled and pushed his way 2,168 miles in 258 days. Took a lot of courage to do it. He met a bear along the way. He just stood still, and the bear left him alone, fortunately. Almost drowned in a swollen river, but he and his dog Orient went most of the distance alone with no guides. There were people who came up and tried to talk to him along the way. Reporters would try to come up and talk to him, and he made the reporters follow along 50 feet behind with the promise that even if I'm going to walk off a cliff, you don't talk to me. And they agreed. So he was just like bound and determined to do this. And you wonder what would make somebody go through all that kind of dedication, trouble, I don't know what you want to call it. And Irwin says, well, no, it wasn't to find myself. It wasn't to prove anything to the blind, but it was to thank God. I thought, wow, that's neat. You'd think he'd be bitter toward God. He went blind at age 36, lost one eye at age 28, went blind by 36. Before that, he had drinking problems, though, and he couldn't stop smoking. He went through 4 marriages, and he says life was just absolutely awful. And then he surrendered himself to God, as he put it, and his relationships improved, his life improved, and he was thankful. And so walking the trail just came into him as he talked with various people as his way of showing thanks to God and talking with God along the way. It took a lot of faith to see the good that God had given to him, faith to see the meaning of his life, and faith to believe in the promise of God. And we're going to talk about that promise of God a little bit today, as we're going to turn to Genesis 47 here. We're going to talk about Jacob. So when you look at Jacob's life in Scripture, his life was really hard. Sometimes you wonder, as you know, why you go on. You encounter troubles in your life. Jacob, he stole Esau's blessing, and he lived in fear of his big brother. He fled to his uncle Laban's house, and he worked there for 7 years for Rachel. And after 7 years of waiting for her, he got Leah instead. And then he had to work another 7 years for Rachel. And Jacob's sheep began to increase more than Laban's. They had this debate between the speckled sheep and the striped sheep or whatever sheep. And Jacob, no matter how they defined it, he always ended up with the most sheep. And so Jacob certainly became disliked by Laban over time as his flocks grew. And so Jacob left at night quickly to return to Esau. And things went well with Esau, but then Simeon and Levi started a war with the neighbors, and Rachel died, and Joseph had a dream implying that he was something special, and his brothers sold him, and Jacob thought that Joseph was dead, and then a famine came, and Jacob's people were hungry for years. And then Jacob had to finally risk his last son of Rachel, Benjamin. He had to risk Benjamin by sending him off to Egypt to get food for the family to keep them alive. And he finds Joseph again. There's joy for a bit, but he dies in a foreign land with much misery ahead for his children that he believes is going to take place. And so it's just a really hard life like that. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 47, verse 7. It tells us there, then Joseph brought his father Jacob in, and presented him before Pharaoh. And after Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. And so Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all of his father's household with food according to the number of their children. Well, life sure hadn't been good to Jacob. 130 years. And you can imagine when he said that, he didn't say it quite as clearly as I did, I guess. What did Jacob have to offer? Interesting, he blesses Pharaoh. Isn't that kind of cool? There he is, struggling along through his life in a foreign land. Pharaoh's not a religious guy. Well, not with Yahweh anyway, right? But Jacob blesses him. Pharaoh's brought good things into his life at the moment. And he describes the few and unpleasant years of his life. 130, I'd like to live to be 130. I don't know about you. But wow, they can be kind of long if they're hard, right? And then they can be difficult to get through. As he's dying, Jacob follows a long-held family tradition. I want to flip over to chapter 48, verse 8. And we look at Jacob, and I think about Jacob in particular because of the unhappiness of his life, because of the hardships, the difficulties. And what really strikes me is what he does here near the end of his life, in the very last moments. Verse 8 of chapter 48 says, "When Israel saw the sons of Joseph, he asked, 'Who are these?' 'They're the sons God has given me here,' Joseph said to his father. And Israel said, 'Bring them to me so I may bless them.' Now Israel's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, 'I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too.' Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knees and bowed down with his face to the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left toward Israel's right hand, and brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph, and he said, 'May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac. May they increase greatly upon the earth.' When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased, so he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to him, 'No, my father, this is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head.' But his father refused and said, 'I know, my son, he too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations.' And he blessed them that day and said, 'In your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh.' And so he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, 'I am about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. Well, Jacob blessed his other sons as well, and their lives were hard. I mean, you look forward to what happened after this. You read on in Genesis and you see 40 years of slavery, or 400 years of slavery, 40 years of struggles in the desert. But Jacob was right? Hundreds of years later, the children, the nation reaches the promised land. Their lives are full of purpose and meaning. They learn through their troubles, and their example, their nation, everything that happened to them makes a difference to your faith today and to mine. It has an impact on every one of us, what happened here in Egypt. What would it be like to bless your children as Jacob did? How did Jacob know what would happen to his children? Why Ephraim over Manasseh? Was he divinely inspired? What happened there? Let's turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. Because Hebrews picks up this story and describes it for us and makes a point. It says, by faith, Hebrews 11:21, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. It's interesting the question that Scripture decided to answer for us. Was he divinely inspired? It doesn't really answer that question in that way. In some way he was, but the question he answers is, how does he do it? He does it by faith. He does it believing that God is a good God, that things will work out. That God has a plan, and God is going to take care of his promises. The ones that have been given to Abraham and others. So you get down to verse 32 of Hebrews 11. It says, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned into strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again, and others were tortured and refused to be released, so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, and yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. I'd say it's still pretty well true today that if you look around at people being flogged, we generally look over and we think, what did they do wrong? You look over at somebody living in a cave, you think, what bad planning they came across. Right? They need to figure things out better. You see somebody living in a sheepskin, wearing a sheepskin, well, who knows what you're thinking there? I don't know. Getting your distance. But you look at those examples, and those are the people who are listed here in Scripture as the people we are to imitate. It's weird. We look around, we're like, nice suits, good jobs, nice house. God's blessing must be there. The writer of Hebrews looks around and goes, guys living in caves, sheepskins, tortured, sawed in half. Good examples for us. Kind of tough to read that in some ways. their parents often had more to do with it than themselves. When you see people who make a lot of money or have the good jobs and the nice house, maybe the parents sacrificed so their children could achieve, passed on a blessing to them and to others. Unfortunately, people today tend to look down on the poor and ragged. But you look at Hebrews 1 through 6, and sometimes you find yourself in that spot, and the question is, how do you live? And God tells us what to do. He says, by faith, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man when he spoke well of his offering. And by faith he still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now, there's the question of if you're earnestly seeking him, right? And those who please God, he says, must have strong faith. The requirement for anyone who worships the Lord to believe that he will deliver on his promises. Hard to see in certain times in our lives. From Jacob's perspective, you got to wonder, how did it look from his perspective? His name becomes Israel. You know, the founder of the nation. What made him great? What set him apart from so many other men and people? What made it so that at the end of his life, it tells us, by faith, Jacob blessed his sons. Blessed the sons of Joseph in particular. And set Ephraim ahead of the other. His life wasn't easy. Was it worth it from his perspective? If he can look down 400 years later and see the nation of Israel formed, see the impact he's had on the world, that'd be a good story for me. I'd love to have that, to leave that kind of legacy and impact on the world. People thinking about God, their lives, how to be better people. People trying to live in faith and hope. And without faith, Jacob had no reason to bless his sons. He had very little to pass on. I leave you my inheritance of $0. They moved to Egypt because they were broke. They were out. Without faith, he had no reason to worship, but with it, his life was valuable to him and he found meaning. It's what he had to offer after the few and unpleasant years of his life, his blessing on those to come, because he had faith. His sons and their sons had troubles, slavery, struggles in the desert, but the nation reached the promised land. God built them into a great people. And they learned through those troubles how to become resourceful, responsible, thankful, and hopeful. Not everybody learns that lesson, right? A lot of people go through those difficulties and they learn a different lesson. They learn how to be downtrodden, overrun. Maybe you felt that way at some point. It's a challenge to live through those things and to find your way through. There was a girl back in 1994, another story in the news in advance. There was a girl in New York who was wandering off in the woods. She got lost. And she was gone for 2 days. No food, no water. And rescuers were scouring the woods. And they were calling out for her, and she was praying. She had found a quiet place near a log and knelt down, and she was praying for most of her days there. She was walking, stopping to pray, and they estimated that she had covered some 12 miles circulating around during this time. But as the rescuers called out for her, the unique thing was she didn't answer. She heard them, but her reasoning was, I prayed for and was praying for rescue, and I'm not going to stop praying until my prayer is done, and then I'll acknowledge my rescuers. She was going to thank God first because she recognized. A lot of us go crazy if we lose our car keys. She's keeping her head while she's lost and counting on God to save her, and tells her rescuers right away, instead of telling her rescuers right away that they found her. Calmness in the middle of chaos, believing in our Father's care, despite what our senses tell us. Our eyes see trees, our noses smell the woods, our ears maybe hear only the birds and the twigs of the branches, and maybe our hands just feel the bark, mouth feels dry, but she felt the sixth sense of faith that everything was going to be okay. And that's a hard thing. It's like telling somebody everything's going to be okay when you don't know everything's going to be okay. But you say it because you have faith that somehow it will be. And that's what God asks us to live by, is the faith that somehow there is a plan, that things are going to be okay. And that we're going to allow God to transform us and place ourselves in His control. Learn to see beyond the bills and the disappointments, the irritations, comments by people around us, and trust the Lord that your life is meaningful and that His promises are worth waiting for. Faith is about seeing beyond what you see right in front of you. God's promises are trustworthy. He is good.